Chapter 14, Presentation Conclusions. Many of you aren't aware just how important conclusions are. As I said in an earlier chapter, we remember beginnings and endings, so conclusions should tie everything together and be impactful. Make it brief, but make it meaningful. About 15 years ago, I was given a piece of advice about conclusions that I'll never forget. Ironically, it's one of the most commonly used endings. Never end your presentation with, quote, "That's it." It's probably the worst ending of all time. Here's why. It's almost as if you're telling your audience that you don't care and that you're too lazy to think of something better. It lacks substance. It lacks meaning. It's just all around lousy. As a general rule of thumb, conclusions ought to be one of these: memorable, personal, dramatic, emotional, funny. Of course, you should put your own twist on these, but here are some general guidelines. The struggle continues, but with your support, it gets a little easier. Seriously consider contributing today. This university gave me so much when I was a student here X years ago, and now it's my turn to give back. In the immortal words of Chuck D, don't believe the hype. Would you have ever thought that a homeless person at age 50 would have been able to turn his life around? So, remember, the only way to achieve equal rights for all is when men and women strive towards equality together. Referencing instead of quoting. Some people like to quote someone famous in their conclusion. There's nothing wrong with this, but a reference to someone may work better than an actual quote. It provides the best of both worlds. It evokes the spirit of a famous historical figure, but remains authentically yours. When I teach a large class, this generally works a bit better with larger classes, I give a small speech at the end of the last day. The speech is general, and I give it to both my undergrad and graduate students. I'm basically saying my goodbye and wishing them well for their future. I normally end with something inspirational from Gandhi, Freud, or someone else. Pick someone that matters to you. And I choose two things attributable to that person and then top it off by saying, and now, I wish those two things for you. Thank you. See, I reference a person without quoting them. I say, I wish those two things for you. The ending is mine, not someone else's. See what I mean? It usually lands a heartfelt applause. It works well. If you can't think of anything, or the nature of your presentation just doesn't call for any of the above, I'm willing to concede that there may be a few presentations that simply don't, then at least give an enthusiastic thank you. If you can't come up with anything clever and want to keep it simple and sincere, there are so much better examples than that's it. Thank you so much for your time. You've been a great audience. Thanks again for having me. I can't tell you how much your time today means to me. I think you get the point. The bottom line here is that you want your conclusion to correlate with your introduction in some meaningful way. Even if you plan to have a Q&A session immediately afterwards, I suggest to still have an actual conclusion. Recaps versus conclusions. When I offered a sample agenda in an earlier chapter, I suggested using takeaways, action points in business meetings. I don't want to quibble over semantics, but I consider that a recap more than a conclusion. Which one you use will depend on the nature of your presentation, and you'll have to use your best judgment. Be mindful of what your objectives are. Here, it may help to ask yourself some of the same questions you asked yourself earlier. What am I trying to accomplish? Or perhaps ask yourself some new questions. Would reminding the audience of key points help to drive the point home? What impression would I like to leave the audience with?